Question 4. Can you talk a bit about environmental information and why it's important? Yeah, this is a good point. It's really important that the interpreters are aware of the difference between working with a deaf client and a deaf-blind client. Deaf people with functional vision, they can see who's coming in and out of the room. They can see where things are placed in the environment. For a deaf-blind person, we have way less access to that information. So it's important that the interpreter gives us that information. For example, letting us know directly, oh, the doctor's on the phone, the doctor is typing on their computer, the doctor has gone to wash their hands. Letting us know where the doctor is, if the doctor's gone to a different room, for instance, to get something out of a filing cabinet. It's good if you can give us that information because then it lets the deaf-blind person know what's going on, and that's a really important part of the job. It's important for interpreters to understand this and why it's important to give a deaf-blind person environmental information. Because often, if you can't see the environment around you, you can't see who's coming into the room, for instance, this will often make deaf-blind people feel like they're not fully included. So it's important for the interpreter to give them that information. Question 5. Tell us about working with deaf interpreters versus hearing interpreters. What's the difference? And what other things do you use to support your communication? I have to say, I think it's wonderful that we're seeing so many deaf interpreters out there and hearing interpreters as well at the moment in the mainstream. For me, I prefer a hearing interpreter. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I still do use deaf interpreters in certain situations, and I'll explain what I mean by that. For any sort of face-to-face communication or anything I'm participating in online, sometimes if it's a deaf person signing, it's hard for me to understand because I don't have the depth perception, or I can only see in one dimension. Makes it hard for me to discern facial expressions and also sometimes to lip read specifically what's going on. So for an example, if a deaf interpreter was signing something like, "Where are you from?" when they use that sign in the middle, I don't know if their word that's being interpreted is location, area, or place. And for me, I love reading English. I grew up doing that. So it's really important that I know what specific words are coming in the source language. I know a lot of deafblind people don't care if the English word is place or area or location in this context. But for me, I really like to have an accurate rendering of what the original information is. So with a hearing interpreter, I find that they tend to use mouth patterns that are more linked to the source language. And for me, I really rely on that lip reading because of how limited my vision is. Often I can see more of the person's mouth patterns than I can their signing. This also speaks to why captions are important for me. Sometimes it's hard for me to understand or to follow. Like if I'm watching the news, for example, I watch the captions and the interpreter. And this is because sometimes the interpreter uses signs I've never seen before. I mean, I'm not that heavily involved in the deaf community. I'm heavily involved in the deaf-blind world, obviously, but I miss out on some of the new language and the new signs. Like Zoom is a perfect example. I'd never seen that sign before. It's like, Zoom, what is that? Because not a lot of deaf-blind people use that program. So when this sign started popping up, I was like, what is that? It's a very popular sign in the deaf community, but it took a while to cop on. So that's a good example of why I sometimes prefer to have a hearing interpreter. But that being said, I really prefer to use deaf interpreters in a deaf context, like in a classroom or a workshop. If everyone's deaf, we've got deaf teachers, deaf guests, and everybody's signing, deaf interpreters are amazing at capturing all those facial expressions and visual information in those contexts. And I would always book a deaf interpreter for that sort of situation, simply because they have that extra skill at mirroring other signing that's going on. So deaf events, deaf contexts, I would use a deaf interpreter. Question 6. Any final tips on interpreting for deaf-blind people? Look, just remember that not all deaf-blind people are the same. It's a very varied community. So just be brave and ask. what people need, and how best you can work with people. Ask them what you need to know. It's important to be brave and open like that. It's also important not to assume that people don't understand or have some kind of cognitive disability. Try and remember that deafblind people are very unique. You have to remember that your job in a deafblind context is not just about providing Auslan or providing information, it's about providing access. So it's natural to ask questions, asking something like, am I standing in the right place? Now, note on the language here, don't say, can you see me? Deafblind people often feel like, we're the ones that are the problem, but really it's the lack of access that creates the problem. So it's important that when you ask questions, you do it in a way that sort of puts the ownership back on you, not onto the deafblind person. So don't say, can you see me? Or something like, I've got a dark shirt on, can you see me? Is that good? No. Ask the question from your perspective. Am I wearing the right colours? Am I standing in an appropriate place? Am I signing too fast? Clarify it from your perspective. Don't throw everything back onto the deafblind person. It's also really important to have the time to do those introductions and warm-up chats. You can't just expect to arrive and jump straight in the way that you might do on other jobs. DBA extends a huge thanks to Paola for her time and insights. This project is funded by the Australian Government Department of Social Services. Go to www.dss.gov.au for more information.